Obandes, you've returned. Listen carefully tonight. It is time for chapter 95. The music was beautiful. That was what made it wrong. Not the hour, not the locked door, not even the empty bench that he could see clearly once he had unlocked the music room and pushed the door open. The music was beautiful in a way that school piano music rarely is, performed with a skill and an emotional depth that belongs to someone who has spent a lifetime learning a piece and has finally understood it completely. Playing it alone, in an empty room, after hours, for no audience, with the particular freedom of someone who is playing because the music requires playing, not because anyone is listening, and the keys were moving. Every note produced by a key depressing and releasing in the correct sequence, with no hands above them. I have heard music like this before, in places where the boundary between the living and whatever lies beyond it has grown thin. It is always the most honest music I have ever heard. A caretaker had worked at an older school building for 11 years. He knew the building well, its sounds, its rhythms, the particular way it behaved after the last staff member had gone home and the building settled into its overnight self. He had a system for his evening rounds, the same route each night, the same order of rooms checked and locked. On the evening in question, he was on the second floor when the music reached him, clearly, unmistakably, coming from the music room at the end of the corridor, locked, as it always was at this hour. He stood in the corridor and listened to the music for a moment, complex, perfectly performed, coming through the locked door with the clarity of something playing at full volume for a room that was not empty. He unlocked the music room door and looked inside. The piano was at the far end of the room, the keys moving, the piece continuing without interruption as he opened the door. He stood in the doorway and watched the keys depress and release in the correct sequence for perhaps 30 seconds. The bench in front of the piano was empty, no one sitting at it, no one in the room at all. He looked carefully, checked every corner. The music did not stop while he looked, did not falter, did not acknowledge the open door or the person standing in it, simply continued, with the focused absorption of someone entirely involved in what they are playing. He watched for perhaps another 30 seconds. Then he closed the door, locked it again, and continued his rounds, and made a small adjustment to his system. If these stories have found their way to you, if you find yourself returning to this quiet room, there is something small you can do, like and subscribe. It tells me, and whatever else watches from this room, that you were here, and that you intend to find your way back. The adjustment was simple. He left the music room until last from that evening onward. He did not avoid it, simply saved it for the end, so that whatever was playing had the maximum amount of uninterrupted time before he came to lock up. He found this arrangement sat comfortably with him. Unlocking the door while the music was playing had felt like an intrusion, like opening a door on someone in a private moment, and leaving it until last was a small courtesy, the kind that cost nothing and seemed worth extending. The music was always finished by the time he reached the room at the end of his adjusted rounds. The piano still, the keys at rest, the room empty and quiet, as though whatever had been playing had known when to stop. He mentioned it to no one for a long time. It felt private, the music room's private business, not something that required reporting or explaining. He simply worked around it, with the quiet professionalism of someone who has decided that certain things in a building they know well are simply features of that building, to be accommodated rather than investigated. He did eventually mention it to a colleague who had worked at the school many years earlier, who listened without surprise, said that a music teacher had spent 30 years at the school, had played that piano every evening after hours for most of those years, had died suddenly during a school concert sometime after her retirement, had apparently not entirely stopped playing. Some musicians simply cannot stop. I have always understood this impulse completely. He worked at that school for another 6 years after first hearing the piano. He never adjusted his system back, always left the music room until last. The music played on certain evenings, not every night, but regularly enough that its absence on other evenings felt like its own kind of presence. He told me he had come to think of the evening piano sessions as something the building offered, a kind of gift from the years the school had accumulated, from the teacher who had spent 30 years loving that instrument in that room. He said he had never heard the piece she played identified, had described it to musicians who visited the school. No one recognized it. He believed she had written it herself and was still performing it. For anyone who had the sense to leave the room until last and let her finish. He said this quietly, with a particular expression of someone describing something they are genuinely grateful for. Every school building in Japan has its own accumulation, its own residue of the decades of human attention and effort and love that passed through its rooms. Most of that accumulation is simply atmosphere, the particular quality of a building that has been used for something meaningful for a long time. But occasionally, in certain rooms, where a particular person spent a particular kind of sustained and devoted attention, something more specific remains. A teacher who played piano every evening for 30 years leaves something in that room that 30 years of daily practice tends to leave. A relationship between a person and an instrument that does not simply conclude because the person is no longer present. Oshoshina. To all the teachers who gave everything to their students and their craft, and who apparently, in some cases, are still giving. Another whispered story from Japan, shared quietly here beside the kotatsu. If you work alone in an older school building after hours and you hear music coming from a locked room, listen for a moment, then continue your rounds. Leave that room until last. Give whatever is playing the time it needs to finish. Because some music teachers spent 30 years loving a piano in a particular room, and the love they gave it did not conclude simply because they did. It simply continued. In the evenings, after hours, when the building is quiet and no one is likely to unlock the door mid-performance, and if you always leave that room until last, and the piano is always quiet by the time you arrive, perhaps that is simply the arrangement, between a caretaker who understood that some things deserve courtesy and a musician who understood that some pieces still need playing. If this story stayed with you, if the dark or the shadow feels a little closer tonight, you know where to find me. I am always here beside the kotatsu, watching, waiting. And if you wish others to find their way here too, there is something small you can do. Like and subscribe. I would not object.